Hey guys, it's Jasma, and today I'm back with another mooncake recipe. So it is now September and the Moon Festival is rolling right around the corner, and every time of this year I like to make some different type of mooncake to share with family and friends. Baking mooncakes is just so fun for me because it kind of feels like Play-Doh, and it's also really nice to kind of change up different fillings and customize the overall looks, play around with different stencils, and overall it's just a really fun dessert to put together. So the Moon Festival is meant for family and friends to gather, so these little desserts are also really easy to share with these different people. So overall, this is just a really great thing for you to try out if you've never done it before. So today I'm making a snow skin mooncake, and I've made plenty of these videos in the past before. This is a little bit different from the traditional mooncake that requires baking. This is kind of similar to a mochi, but instead you have a different filling inside, and you also have to press it to make a specific shape. So first we're going to make the snow skin for these mooncakes. Now I've gotten different questions on whether or not you can replace any of these ingredients, so I'm going to quickly explain what each of them do and why it's important for you to add all of them to create the final result. So first things first, we have glutinous rice flour. This is probably the most important part in making the snow skin for these mooncakes because the glutinous rice flour is what adds the stickiness and the stretchiness of the final mooncake. Next we have rice flour, and what this does, it kind of acts like cornstarch, so it makes the mooncake skin really soft and kind of smooth overall. And lastly we have wheat flour, and this just makes the skin more translucent and clear overall. And finally, to add some sweetness, we have the icing sugar. So quickly mix all of these together so they're combined, and you should be able to find all of these ingredients in any Chinese grocery store or places like Walmart. Now that that's combined, I'm going to add in the wet ingredients. So starting off, I'm going to add half of the milk, and I like to add half for now because if you stir in a little bit of the wet ingredients, it actually avoids lumps from forming. Once the mixture is smooth, add in all the rest of the wet ingredients. So that's the rest of the milk. Flavorless oil. You can use any type of oil as long as it's not olive oil and has a really strong flavor or color. And lastly, some sweetened condensed milk. Everything is mixed in and the mixture is now nice and smooth. If you see that you still have some lumps left over, you can choose to pass it through a strainer. So now this is already in a steam-proof bowl, so I'm going to place it onto the stove. I already have a pot of boiling water with a rack inside, and we're going to bring this over. Before putting on the lid, I like to fold up a piece of kitchen towel to form kind of a stopper between the lid. If you don't do this, all of the water vapor that is going to form while this is steaming is going to drip back into the mixture and mess with the ratio and the overall texture of the final result. So make sure you do it. This is going to steam for 25 minutes, and we're going to test it later on to see if it's cooked. Meanwhile, we can make the coconut filling. So for the coconut filling, we're going to make something quite simple. You really just mix everything together. So first things first, I'm going to add my melted butter into a bowl along with the icing sugar. Give it a quick mix. Now I'm going to add in my 2 eggs, one at a time. I'm going to add in the sweetened condensed milk. Next, I have some canned coconut milk to add to this mixture. If you don't want to add this, you can just use regular milk, but I do like to add some more coconut flavor since this is a coconut filling. So make sure that you're using a canned condensed coconut milk like this. You don't want to use the type that you would usually drink and put in your cereal because that type of coconut doesn't have a strong flavor and as thick of a consistency as this type. I'm going to open this up. And now for the most important ingredient in the filling is of course coconut flakes. So here I have some medium-sized unsweetened coconut flakes that I found at Bulk Barn because I still want to be able to see and taste the coconut, but I don't want to change up the overall consistency and texture too much. If you have really large coconut flakes and you can't find any smaller ones, you could just place it into a blender, mix it up until it's a little bit finer. I'm going to place this into the mixture. And the last ingredient is some glutinous rice flour, so just add that to the mix as well. The mixture is now combined. Make sure you scrape the sides and the bottom of the bowl to make sure everything is mixed in. So now that this is ready, we're going to go check on the snow skin for these mooncakes, and we can switch them so this can go into the steam pot as well. To see if the the mixture is fully cooked, just cut it open and see if any liquids come out. Cut it open with a knife, and I like to break it up into smaller pieces to help it cool faster. And you'll see that there's a layer of oil on top that has separated. Don't worry about that, we're going to knead it back in. Then using a spatula, loosen it away from the sides of the bowl. Breaking up these pieces is going to make everything cool down a little bit faster, but also combine the oil back into the mixture. You can choose to do two things here. If you don't have a stand mixer, you can wait till this cools down completely before you knead everything until it's nice and smooth. But since I like to make life a little bit easier, I would usually put this into a stand mixer bowl and mix it with a paddle attachment until everything is smooth and incorporated. If you don't have that, of course, you can do the other option. You can see after the mixer has mixed it, it is now nice and stretchy. It looks almost translucent, and all of the oil has been mixed back into the mixture, so the overall dough is no longer as shiny as it was before. So now that this is done mixing, I'm going to transfer it onto a sheet of plastic wrap. You can also place it into a bowl and cover it, but I find that putting it on a piece of plastic wrap is easiest because it doesn't stick to anything. While the filling is being steamed for 20 minutes, I'm going to quickly make some natural food coloring out of beets. So beets has a really strong color. It stains pretty much anything it touches. So it's actually perfect for dyeing the stove mooncake because you don't need to add as much as you have to with other types of food coloring. Just firstly, we're going to wash it until it's nice and clean. I'm using 2, so I'm making a pretty big batch here, but if you don't think you're going to use as much, you can just use 1 beet. Since the color of the beet can stain your hand really easily, I like to peel it under running water so that your hands can stay the color that they actually are. And since I'm working with beets here, I'm not going to be brave and not put on an apron since I am wearing a white shirt. So make sure you're careful with it because this really can stain anything. You don't need to chop this up any smaller because we are going to be blending it in a blender. Add about half a cup of drinking water. There are no more larger clumps of beet, so now this is ready to go. And I'm going to pass it through this really fine bag. This is a sieve. You can use just a regular sieve as well, but I found that this gets rid of most of the pulp and leaves you with a really smooth food coloring at the end. Because the last thing that you want is to have clumps of beet inside of your mooncake. You want to have a really even coloring for your skin. So you can choose to use gloves because most likely your hands are going to get stained. I strained out about a cup of the beet juice, so now I'm going to place this into a mini saucepan and put it over the stove and turn the heat on to high. We're going to cook it down until it reduces to about 1/4 cup. So it's important that you reduce the amount of juice that you have here because you want this to be a little bit thicker so that you don't have to add too much liquid to the final product. Now the color of the beet juice will change since you are cooking it, but at the end of the day it's still going to create a really pretty pink color for your mooncakes. So make sure you keep stirring it while it's on the stove and turn it down to medium once it starts to boil. Make sure you keep stirring the sides so nothing burns, and once it's cooked down enough, transfer it into a measuring cup and let it cool down completely. I made quite a lot of beet juice since you'll only need about a couple drops every time you use it, so the best way to store this is to put it into an airtight container and place it into the freezer. So it stays nice and fresh, and you can just take out a little bit and let it thaw and use it every time you need it. My coconut filling has cooked on the stove for 25 minutes. It is now nice and solidified. It will still be soft though, but there should not be any excess liquid coming out when you poke the center of the filling. So to make sure it cools down faster, I'm going to transfer it to another bowl that is nice and clean. Let's flatten, cover it with a lid, and place it into the fridge for it to chill for about 30 minutes. Now that the coconut filling is nice and stiff, we can weigh it out into 25-gram little balls. So I'm making 50-gram mooncakes, and usually I like the ratio of the skin and the filling to be half and half, but of course you can choose to change that up based off of your personal preferences. So I've lined everything with plastic wrap to make sure that the filling doesn't stick. It also makes cleanup a lot easier. I'm just going to use a spoon to measure out 25-gram filling. Then roll into a nice and tight ball. You want to make sure there's no air bubbles in between. Try not to work with it too much because the butter will melt due to the temperature of your hands. Cover the filling with plastic wrap so it doesn't dry out while it's chilling in the fridge. And it's important for you to measure out the filling first because this has to be a little bit more stiff than the skin. This is going to make the assembly much easier. Lastly, before we assemble everything together, we're going to cook some glutinous rice flour. So this is going to be used to prevent the mooncakes from being too sticky while assembling, but since we're not cooking the mooncakes later on, it's important to cook the flour beforehand so you're not eating it raw. I'm using 1 cup total, but you probably won't use all of it, so you can adjust that based off of how much you want to make. Turn the heat up to high and constantly stir this. It's going to take a little bit before it starts to brown, but the second that it starts, it's going to become brown really quickly overall. So when that starts to happen, make sure you turn the heat down to medium. Once the overall mixture has browned evenly, turn the heat off. Take it immediately off the heat and transfer into a cool bowl. So now the glutinous rice flour is cooked and safe to eat. Doing this is similar to when you want to cook off the raw edge off of flour when you're trying to make edible cookie dough. So since we're not going to cook the mooncakes later on, it's important that you don't skip this step so you're not eating any raw flour. We have everything ready to go so we can start to assemble the mooncakes. So firstly, you want to make sure that the skin and the filling are both nice and chilled. It's important that you're patient enough for it to get really cold because once it's colder, it's stiffer, which means it's easier to put together since it won't fall apart in your hands. You may find that it starts to soften up at room temperature, so something that I may recommend doing is to just put half in the fridge while we work with the other half. You can just save yourself a little bit of time to have to wait for it to cool altogether. I also have my mooncake molds here ready to go. Make sure after you wash this that you dry it so it's really clean. You don't want there to be any type of moisture within these molds because it's going to cause the mooncake dough to stick to it and kind of ruin up your mooncake. We also have the little stencils here. This may be a little bit difficult to dry up on the spot, so I actually recommend you cleaning this earlier so you can kind of air dry and just speed things up a little. You also want to have a bench scraper ready to go. This is just easier to cut the dough and divide things up without it sticking too much to your hands, because if you have to dig your fingers into it, it can get a bit messy. And lastly, we have the electrical scale once again wrapped in plastic wrap so nothing sticks. So first I'm going to start off by dyeing a part of my dough with the red color so it kind of forms a really nice and light pink. Of course there's no rules here on whatever colors you want to use. You can go look at my all natural food coloring video to find out what other different colors you can use for the mooncake and just make it really nice and colorful. I'm going to stick with 1 today. Make sure you cover up the dough when you're not working with it so it doesn't become dried. Start off by adding just a little bit of the coloring because this is actually pretty opaque. Then just knead it in by folding it over. Try to avoid touching the coloring as much as possible because it does make your fingers colorful. So just fold it over repeatedly and it'll slowly incorporate itself into the rest of the dough. Oh, and by the way, I'm using a silicone mat as my work surface here because I find that it's the best way to avoid this stuff from sticking to it, but it also doesn't move around a lot because it's nice and sturdy and heavy, so it stays on the countertop. If you don't have a silicone mat, you can try to put a piece of plastic wrap onto a cutting board or just lay down a piece of plastic wrap as it is with a little bit of water on the bottom. That also works, but I find that this is the best thing I like to use. Try not to over knead this because it does soften up the dough and make it sticky again. Now that this is mixed through, I'm going to dip it in a little bit of that glutinous rice flour to avoid it from sticking. And I'm actually going to place this back into the fridge so that it can firm up a little bit while I work on a few plain ones for now. I'm going to start off by just making a few mooncakes without any color in it, just to show you kind of the basics on how to do it. And then you can also kind of play around with it. Once you're comfortable with it, it's easier to add more colors and change up the designs. So firstly, unwrap the dough and just cut out a portion of this. Since once again my mooncake molds hold 50 grams, I'm doing 1-to-1 ratio between the filling and the dough. So since the filling is 25, the outer skin is also going to be 25 grams. And of course it's interchangeable. If you want to have more filling or more skin, you can also change that up based on your preferences. Take the piece of dough and roll it around in your hand to soften it up slightly. I sometimes like to knead it just to make sure that everything's even. And once you have a smooth ball, dip it into a little bit of the flour to avoid it from sticking. Roll it around to dust off any excess. And now place the ball in your hands and flatten it with your palms. You can also use a rolling pin if you'd like to, but I don't find it necessary. And then just flatten the edges a little bit more. You want the center to be slightly thicker. This is going to avoid the bottom of the mooncake to just have a clump of the skin without a lot of filling. Once you've reached a general size like this, you want it to be a little bit bigger than your filling. Take a piece of your coconut filling and place it into the center. Flip it over. Use your index finger and your thumb to slowly push the skin down the sides of the filling until the top is slightly closed up. And flip it over and slowly close it up. And continue to use your fingers to push the edges together. And it's important that you really don't allow any air bubbles to form between the filling and the skin, because later on when you cut it, you don't want huge air pockets in between. Put it in a little bit more of that glutinous flour to avoid this from sticking to the mold. And then place it onto the mat. Use your hands to kind of shape it into a slightly taller cylinder so that it can fit into the mold without it getting caught on the sides. And before I usually press it, I like to just dip it into a little bit more of that glutinous rice flour and kind of press the stencil into it. There is already a lot of glutinous rice flour on the mooncake, so it shouldn't stick, but this is just to get those little gaps so that it's like double insurance and it doesn't ruin the shape of the mooncake. For aggressively tapping that, we can start to stencil on the mooncake. And just press it over the mooncake. Make sure you're holding the bottom of the mold down so the mooncake cannot escape from the sides when you press it. Then apply firm pressure evenly. And there you have a mooncake. Now I'm going to start playing around with a few colors. So firstly, I want to make the design kind of look like the top that has the actual pattern is a different color than the rest of the body. So to do that, I'm going to start off by measuring out just about 5 grams of the pink dough that I dyed. It is now nice and chilled. I just measured it out so that the rest of the mooncake can still have a 1-to-1 ratio between the filling and the skin. That's why I'm making this 5, and then later on when I measure out the white, it would just be 20 grams. And then to do that, we're going to take the stencil. I like to dip it into the glutinous rice flour first, and then we're just going to press this into the stencil and make sure that the top is nice and flat. We're doing this separately now so that later when we make the entire mooncake, this can become attached onto the rest of the body and make it look like one. You want to make sure you don't put too much flour on the bottom of the thing that you're pressing onto the stencil, because it has to be sticky enough to stick to the rest of the mooncake. So what I like to do is to actually rub a little bit of water into it before I stick it together. I also like to rub a little bit of the water onto the mooncake itself. Place the stencil into the mooncake mold. Make sure you lock it in place. Now I'm going to play around with kind of marble mooncakes. So to do this, it's pretty simple. Just make sure that whatever amount of red or white that you use, you just want both of them to equal 25 grams when you put them together. So with that, you can really play up and change up how much of each color you add to give it a different color. So with these two, I'm going to roll them into kind of little snakes, right? And then I like to press it on like this. If you ever play with Play-Doh a lot or like clay, this must be pretty familiar to you. You just want to create kind of a marble design. Roll it in, and then I like to twist it just a couple times and then roll it into a ball. And I find that when you roll it, if you press the dough between your hands a little bit, it kind of blends the colors together a little bit nicely, and it actually creates a really pretty result. And keep in mind that when you press it, it actually blends the dough even more, so don't go too far the first time you do it. And there you have a really pretty marble mooncake. Another way to create marble mooncakes that look a little bit more natural is to just add the food coloring straight onto the plain white dough. This can create more of a natural and random look every single time, and you can't really get it to repeat, which kind of gives it a more natural look. So this is actually pretty simple. You just flatten out the dough slightly and dab on a few streaks of that coloring Again, keep in mind this is a very opaque natural food color, so don't go too crazy on that. And then you want this to actually stay on the outside this time, and we're just going to pull it so that you create the streaks, and then roll it into a ball. And again, when you're rolling it, you want to be pressing it in and kind of pushing on it so that it forces the color to blend into the dough a little bit more. So that's it with these coconut snowy mooncakes for this autumn festival. I really hope that you can try these out because not only are they fun to put together, but it also tastes delicious. The coconut flakes add a very interesting texture compared to the smooth and silky snowy mooncake skin, and the flavors just balance each other out very well, and these mooncakes are also not overly sweet. This recipe itself makes 24 50-gram snowy mooncakes, so there's plenty to go around and share with everybody. It is recommended for you to chill this for at least 1 hour in the fridge so that all the flavors can come together and the mooncakes can firm up a little bit. That has the best texture for to eat by then. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and see you guys next time. Bye!